Hello, and thanks again as always for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather. Up first, let's see, satellite imagery showing low pressure rolling up near Yakutat, low center pulling northward there off the north coast of the Panhandle with front pushing in across the southeast coast today, bringing gusty winds and some moderate amounts of rainfall to many areas of the Panhandle from Dixon Entrance on up in toward Haines and Skagway. Otherwise, break across portions of south and southeast Alaska today. Some sunshine over northern Cook Inlet, possibly in the Madanuska-Susitna Valley, with temperatures rising into the mid to upper 30s. 37 this afternoon, for example, at Palmer. And some breaks over the Copper River Basin. Otherwise, clouds you can see into the central interior, kind of streaming northward there. And northerly flow across the Chukchi Sea and the northern Bering Sea, coming southward on some pretty gusty northerly winds, which are gusting as high as 50 miles an hour at St. Paul and St. George Island, bringing cold air southward, snowfall levels coming down to near sea level into the as far south as eastern Aleutians there and in toward the Alaska Peninsula today. And on the chart, you can see low pressure over eastern Norton Sound, and most of the action back on the west side of that system there, with snow and blowing snow, winds gusting anywhere from 40 to 55 miles an hour, St. Lawrence Island, up through the Bering Strait into the northwest coast. A few scattered snow showers over the northwest interior there to the western Brooks Range, maybe the North Slope areas. Otherwise, mostly dry over the eastern interior today, and some scattered shower activity this afternoon along the Alaska Range and possibly over the Kenai Peninsula areas, and a little bit more, about 4/10 of an inch of rain falling at Cordova. And then that system pulling in near Yakutat, that brought inch and a half of rain today to Dry Bay there on the north coast of the Panhandle. Petersburg and Haines both had an inch and a half of rain also, with about 1.15 inches falling at Sitka during the same 12-hour period, ending at 3 p.m. this afternoon. Out to the west, about a third of an inch of rain and snow fell at Unalaska today, and with gusty winds out there as well. In fact, northerly winds gusted as high as 60 miles per hour there at Nikolsky on the west side of Unmak Island. And again, as I mentioned, 50-mile-an-hour wind gusts reported at the Pribilofs. And on the Panhandle there, one of the stronger wind gusts, Heidelberg, had 56 miles per hour recorded in that location. And lighter winds out over the central Aleutians with kind of a break there, and you can see the next system pushing into the far northwestern Bering Sea. And tonight, that really doesn't push too much farther to these kind of weekends there, with a warm front developing over the northwest Bering Sea. A couple of troughs continue to come southward there, with those gusty winds continuing. Winds lightening up over the eastern Aleutians and western Alaska Peninsula, as well as the Pribilofs tonight, with snow showers becoming a little more intermittent and scattered, but snow continuing at times along especially the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula. Snow and blowing snow for possibly along the southwest coast of Nunivak Island, as well as St. Lawrence Island into the Bering Strait, and not much change for the northwest coast, western Arctic coast. Isolated snow showers over the western interior, could be a little more widespread there along the mid-Yukon River Valley, maybe into the Koyukuk Valley to the western Brooks Range, but nothing too terribly heavy expected. And rain and snow showers for the North Gulf Coast, as well as the Panhandle. Winds lightening up front off to the east and dissipating. Another trough kind of swings in, keeps it showery, but winds will be much lighter across all of the southeast coast tonight. And then for tomorrow, see, a weak cold front may drop snowfall levels back down to sea level, northern Cook Inlet and the Kenai Peninsula, but look for mixed light precipitation tomorrow, with not so much in the way of clearing as what we saw today, especially over northern Cook Inlet, but rain and snow showers or rain and snow periods from the North Gulf Coast. It'll be light, though, and that trough will keep it unsettled as it moves on to the southeast coast during the day. Otherwise, Copper River Basin, much of the northern interior areas look pretty dry with maybe a few isolated snow showers here and there scattered around, but basically looking at mostly cloudy skies, light winds, and pattern starting to weaken there. That northerly wind flow over the eastern Bering Sea through the Bering Strait, still pretty breezy, but less wind tomorrow than what you saw today and overnight tonight, and diminishing even further during the afternoon. Winds really lightening up for the Alaska Peninsula, but still that overwater trajectory of the cold air coming southward over the open Bering Sea, producing snow showers mostly, if not completely, on the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula. So probably snow-free or shower-free for places like Sandpoint to Chignik and those areas. And Kodiak Island, chance of some rain or snow showers. And then out to the west, finally, you can see a little pressure, a little more organized now, that frontal system over the Kamchatka Peninsula. That'll be moving eastward, but for tomorrow, it looks like a break over the Aleutians, mostly dry conditions, a little breezy, but some scattered shower activity, and that's about it. And then that front moves into the northwest Bering Sea, pushing eastward across the central and eastern Bering in the afternoon, with warm front will bring rain into the Pribilof Islands, and then mixing with snow back toward the cold front there, but all that action staying north of the Aleutians. Could see a few showers for Adak and Atka, but dry all the way back to Shemya. And then an increasing chance of moisture late in the afternoon and probably evening as that cold front drags across that area. And some warm front, light rain, fog, drizzle for the eastern Aleutians, maybe the Alaska Peninsula, but most of that moisture staying back to the northwest. Look for the winds and chances of snow to increase for St. Lawrence Island late in the afternoon. Otherwise, some light snow flurries there for the Bering Strait and along the northwestern Arctic coast. Dry over interior Alaska, increasing winds with tightening gradient over Kodiak Island, Resurrection Bay, and the Copper River Delta for those northerly winds. Storm warnings moving into the Panhandle in the afternoon. Southern Panhandle and all along the southeast coast there. Look for 50-knot winds with rain heavy at times, especially on the south coast. And slowly moving northward with some rain and snow mixed. Lynn Canal Glacier Bay, especially along the Klondike Highway, again above 2,500 feet. And for the lows tonight, upper 30s and lower 40s for the southeast coast. Otherwise, near 20 for the Copper River Basin. Upper 20s to lower 30s, south central Alaska. Mid 30s, though, Seward, Homer, Seldovia, as well as Kodiak. Upper 20s to near 30 for Bristol Bay. Mid-teens, northern Kuskokwim Valley to lower 20s to the south. Highs for tomorrow in the 20s for the Kuskokwim Valley. Lower to mid-30s Bristol Bay, near 40 for Kodiak Island. Otherwise, lower to mid-30s south central Alaska. Looking for mid-20s Copper River Basin in the 40s for the Panhandle, followed by lows again, upper 30s to lower 40s for the southeast coast, down to around 9 for McGrath, Nikolai, Gulkana, Glen Ellen, and 20s across the Madanuska-Susitna Valley down into the Kenai Peninsula. Kodiak down into the upper 20s, mid-teens for Bristol Bay, and 10 to 15 for the Kuskokwim Valley. Highs 15 to 20 for the Kuskokwim Valley on Wednesday afternoon, mid-teens for the Copper River Basin, lower to mid-30s south central Alaska, upper 30s Kodiak Island to Homer, and in the 40s for the southeast coast. Up to the north, lows tonight, single numbers in teens for much of the area, all the way up to the Arctic coast, closer to 20 out to the Seward Peninsula area, then 15 for St. Lawrence Island. Highs, Gamble, Savunga in the upper teens, mid-20s for Homer, Nome, and in the teens for the eastern interior, followed by lows anywhere from 0 to 10 above central and eastern interior, as well as all the way out to the Arctic coast and North Slope, and in the teens for the Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island. And for highs, 10 to 15 over the interior to the Arctic coast, and 15 to 22 out to the west. Out to the southwest, lows tonight, lower 20s along the southwest coast and Pribilofs, otherwise in the 30s for the Aleutians, upper 20s to lower 30s for the Alaska Peninsula. Highs tomorrow, 40 to 45 for the Aleutians, warmest out west, near freezing for the Pribilofs, upper teens for St. Lawrence Island, mid-20s along the southwest coast. Lows in the 20s, Alaska Peninsula, Pribilofs, and teens to near 20 for the southwest coast, otherwise upper 30s, central western Aleutians, followed by highs Wednesday afternoon, lower to mid-40s for all of the Aleutians, and mostly in the upper 30s for the Alaska Peninsula, near 40 for the Pribilofs, and mid to upper 20s south.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on into flying weather, we've got A lot of IFR up over the northwest quarter of the state and eastward there along the eastern North Slope and Arctic coast, and another band extending southward into the central interior to the western Alaska Range. IFR for the North Gulf Coast from about Resurrection Bay eastward and into the northern portions of Lynn Canal and Glacier Bay. Marginal VFR for the remainder of the Panhandle. Some IFR over the eastern interior, and then a more widespread area of VFR there from the southeastern Brooks Range across the Yukon Flats down into the Susitna, Matanuska Valley, Copper River Basin. Some VFR over the southwest interior and the lower Yukon River Valley, with marginal VFR along the southwest coast. IFR, though, for Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island. Not too bad out over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians, mostly VFR from the Nikolsky westward to the Komodorskis, and looks like it may become VFR for the Pribilof Islands. We'll see here for the afternoon forecast. It does. VFR for St. Paul, St. George, St. Matthew Island. Marginal VFR for the western Aleutians. VFR, Adak and Atka. Back to marginal for the Fox Islands. And the Bering Sea side, the Alaska Peninsula, looks marginal, but Sandpoint, Chignik, on up across Kodiak Island, northeast Bristol Bay. VFR, lower and mid Yukon River Valley, VFR, and areas of VFR over the eastern interior with some lingering IFR there along the Yukon River, and then widespread IFR, Koyukuk, Kobuk Valley, northward to the Arctic coast, and areas of IFR for the North Gulf Coast, now into Cook Inlet and the Kenai Peninsula, as well as the Coast Range, eastern North Gulf Coast Range into the extreme northern Panhandle. For the morning hours Wednesday, IFR, Prince William Sound, eastern North Gulf Coast, down to about Elfin Cove eastward to near Juneau, and then northward to Skagway, marginal VFR down toward Dixon Entrance, Kodiak Island VFR, northeast Bristol Bay, central interior VFR, some marginal VFR areas of the Kuskokwim Valley, then IFR for the central western Brooks Range and the western Arctic coast, and some IFR extending down through the Bering Strait, all the way down to the Yukon Delta. Narrow band of VFR now over the eastern Bering Sea, including the Pribilofs and Unalaska Island, otherwise marginal for Unimak Island westward to Shimia. And for Wednesday afternoon, IFR around St. Matthew Island, otherwise marginal for most of the Aleutians, with a pretty good area of VFR either side of that zone into interior Alaska, some marginal VFR for the North Gulf Coast, IFR for the western Brooks Range, central western Arctic coast, and the northern Panhandle. Passes Anatuvik and Adigan for the day on Tuesday. Both look IFR on either entrance, Lake Clark and Merrill. Marginal VFR mostly throughout the day Tuesday. Rainy, same forecast, marginal VFR, both west and eastern approach. Windy, marginal VFR, lowest conditions, southern entrance. Isabel, though, looks VFR. And Mentasta will be VFR for the day Tuesday. Tanita, VFR as well. And Portage, IFR to start, becoming marginal late in the morning and through the afternoon. Chilkoot and White, IFR. And for the freezing levels at the surface there across southern Alaska, just south of the Pribilofs, and 2,000 feet Kodiak Island across the northern Panhandle, and 4,000 feet down over the Queen Charlottes. For icing, areas of isolated moderate there, Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula, Kuskokwim Valley, and especially along the eastern North Gulf Coast into the Panhandle, and some elevated icing threats there for the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, along the southwest coast, as well as the north central interior out to the eastern Arctic coast. And moving on to the 33,000-foot wind flow chart, we've got pretty good winds out of the northwest there across the central Bering Sea down to the eastern Aleutians up to 105 knots. Otherwise, it looks like southeast coast there on the north side of the jet with the strongest winds across the Queen Charlottes. And at 9,000 feet, pretty light variable winds over interior Alaska, both at 33 and 9,000 feet. Light westerlies into the Panhandle, but 40 to 65 knot winds starting out of the north to northwest there across the eastern Bering Sea and Alaska Peninsula. 3,000 feet, 55 knots just north of St. Lawrence Island and the eastern Aleutians. Turbulence, occasional moderate chop, Kodiak Island, Alaska Peninsula, and all of the Aleutians and the extreme northwest coast.
Hello again, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. And joining us again, talking about the augmented reality sandbox, is Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska. And he's actually talking about a project from AKwx, which is the experimental program to stimulate competitive research. A lot of acronyms, but some really fun stuff today, right, Eric?
You bet. We've got a learning tool that is a tool that's fun to use, and it really has a relevance to actually daily lives of anyone who goes outside and sees lumpy topography in Alaska. We've got a lot of mountains and such. You know, when I was younger and go on your first hike in the hills, say, you're given, maybe you're in the Boy Scouts or you get at the kiosk at the trailhead, a topographic map, a flat piece of paper with all these lines on it, bullseyes, long lines that curve back on themselves, say, perhaps things that look like this, a quadrangle or a topographic map. We've got here just to illustrate a couple of examples near Denali. Alaska has so much topography, so many mountains. And what are all these lines that we see? It can be tough to know what this means the first time you look at it. What we've got, all these lines represent lines of where the elevation of the topography goes through a certain level above sea level. Say that this line represents where the mountains have gone from below 1,000 feet, mean sea level, up through 1,000 feet and above. That's your 1,000-foot contour. And when the mountain keeps going up, you're up to 1,200 feet, 1,400 feet, and so on. And that's how you get this little bullseye around the peak of a mountain.
Kind of makes layered slices, right?
Kind of like layered slices. Nice way to look at that. And when you see the lines are closer together, you're going up more steeply. If the mountain rises more slowly, it takes you longer in horizontal space to go through those different vertical increments.
That is really hard to visualize.
Right. Imagine you're looking at a 2D piece of paper, two-dimensional piece of paper, but you're trying to understand what the three-dimensional world looks like. Well, enter the augmented reality sandbox. Yes, what is that? It is right here. We have the sandbox with us today, Sandbox 2.0, portable version. Sweet. Built up at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we've got a couple of folks helping out today.
Let's see, Alana Valaji, and she's a mechanical engineering student from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. If you want to give us a thumbs up there, Alana, thanks for helping us out today. And Courtney Breest, she's the outreach coordinator from AKwx, also helping us out today. Thanks, Courtney.
And this tool here has a Microsoft Kinect to sense the level of sand in this sandbox. And then the Kinect feeds its information into a computer that then sends a signal to a projector to draw the appropriate topographic lines on this topography. The fun thing about this, as we can see here, is that the sandbox and its Kinect and its projector, they all work as a team. So here we've got a mountain in the middle of the sandbox. What if we took down the mountain to some degree? Watch as the software responds and redraws the topography.
Kind of a caldera forming there.
There you go, And what's fun about the sandbox too is it knows that gravity flows downhill, and we've got some water that's actually down in the lowest elevations. And what's happening now is we're making it rain a little bit. We'll fill up rain into that elevated lake bed, that caldera, as you said. And so now water is pooled up there. And what if you gouged out an outlet channel?
Glacial dam release.
There you go. The water flows out. What we're seeing here is a tool that allows people to touch and connect Microsoft Connect, RRR, to connect two-dimensional topographic maps like what we have here, these flat things on a piece of paper, to the real three-dimensional world. I think this Sandbox's real particular application as a learning tool to young people is, what does a two-dimensional map mean when it's trying to represent the three-dimensional world? This sandbox is kind of both at once. It's actually three-dimensional, lumpy topography there, the sand, but it's got these lines drawn on the three-dimensional sand that would be on a two-dimensional piece of paper.
Wow, that is a huge leap from the learning that we experienced when we were younger to how children and even adults are visualizing in this new forms of technology. It allows that to kind of reshape their thinking and visualize this in a very useful and absolutely hands-on way. It's amazing.
It's a hands-on tool, and
it's hard for me to sit here and not go play with that.
Well, that's what happened at GINA up at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks when the first model was was being made, the prototype with plywood and such, we had professional adult professor types had heard about this, and they came by because they wanted to see how it worked.
Okay.
And everyone becomes that idealistic, wonder-filled youngster.
Sure.
And you just can't help but play with that, and to see how it reacts in time, and
Right.
It's a dynamic learning tool, and it responds.
That's exactly the word. Yeah.
And you wonder what applicabilities beyond a teaching tool for
Where does it
topography
go?
can it have? You can see how in Alaska we have inundation mapping is an issue. If you had water slosh inland, say in a coastal flooding event on the western coast of Alaska or the Arctic coast, you could see this. The concept is illustrated here as an introductory learning method. I think this is a potentially good outreach tool for all of us in Alaska.
Okay, so not only just a topographical sense, a mapping sense, maybe something that leads into understanding of how geographic information systems work with GIS, but also geology, if we wanted to get into kind of the formations and the bigger land masses and the representation of the 2D map. We could go into hydrology, which is very important in Alaska, of course, and even just understanding the weather sense. Mounding up a big pile of sand could be that Arctic high-pressure system sitting on top of Fairbanks, and the voids would be low-pressure systems. This can go a lot of different directions.
Yes, exactly. Wow. It's not just landforms, but pressure has contours of high pressure and low pressure. And I wish I had this kind of a learning tool when I was taking Meteorology 101 back 25 years ago.
Wow.
Would have been helpful, I think.
Probably would have gotten a better grade, yeah. Okay, thank you so much for coming by, Eric, and Alana and Courtney, thank you so much for your help there in the sandbox. We are going to play in the sandbox a little bit more coming up tomorrow on our next edition of Alaska Weather Facts. We hope you join us for that. In the meantime, make sure you go to alaska.edu/EPSCOR. That's alaska.edu EPSCOR to learn more information about what we're doing with this augmented reality sandbox around Alaska. We'll see you next time on Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Coastal water forecast for the Panhandle: south winds 15 to 20 knots, 10-foot seas for the south coast, north coast, south winds 15 knots. And the central northern inside waters, southeast winds of 15 knots with 3-foot seas. And for Clarence Strait, southeast winds 20 knots. For the day Wednesday, big increase in the winds, storm warnings for the south coast, southeast 50 knots, seas building to around 30 feet. And for the north coast, east-southeast winds 50 knots. Lynn Canal, north winds at 20 knots, otherwise gales for Stevens Passage, southeast winds 40 knots. Storm warnings also for Clarence Strait, southeast winds 50 knots, seas 20 feet. Prince William Sound, Tuesday, east winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet. Eastern North Gulf Coast, southeast winds of 15 knots, and west winds 20 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Barren Islands, west winds 25 knots, west winds 30 knots for Kamishak Bay. And Cook Inlet, variable to west winds 10 to 20 knots. For the day Wednesday, northern Cook Inlet, north winds at 15 knots. South of the Foreland, small craft advisories, north winds 25 knots, west winds 30 knots for Kamishak Bay. Barren Islands, gale warnings, north winds 35 knots, and small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast for north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Prince William Sound, north winds 20 knots, seas only 3 feet. Kodiak Island, small craft advisories, west winds 25 to 30 knots on Tuesday. Gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, northwesterlies at 35 knots, and Bristol Bay, small craft advisories, northwest winds 30 knots. And for Wednesday, Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 30 to 35 knots. Bristol Bay, northwest at 30 knots with 10-foot seas. Kodiak Island, northwest winds 30 knots. For the eastern Aleutians, west-northwest winds 35 to 40 knots with seas anywhere from 10 to 16 feet. Gale warnings for the central Aleutians, west winds 35 knots. And Amchitka Island, westerlies at 30 knots. And from Kiska to Shemya, gale warnings southwest at 35 knots. And for Wednesday, gale warnings for the western Aleutians, west winds 35 to 40 knots, and gale warnings for Adak and Atka, southwesterlies at 35 knots. For the Fox Islands, west winds 30 to 35 knots, seas 12 to 15 feet. For the Yukon Delta coast and St. Lawrence Island on Tuesday, gale warnings for those areas for northwest winds at 35 knots. Otherwise, St. Matthew Island, St. Paul, St. George, and the Kuskokwim Delta coast winds will be northwest at 30 knots. For the day Wednesday, Pribilof, southwest winds 30 knots. Kuskokwim Delta coast west winds at 30 knots. South winds 30 knots for St. Matthew Island. Yukon Delta coast southeast winds 25 knots. And then back to the north at 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island. For the Arctic coast, central and eastern Beaufort Sea coastline up there, northeast winds for Tuesday at 20 knots. Small craft advisories for the western Arctic coast for northeast winds 25 to 30 knots with seas up around 8 to 10 feet. And gale warnings from Cape Thompson to Wales, north winds 35 knots, seas 12 feet. And for Wednesday, small craft advisories for the area from Wales to Cape Thompson, north winds 25 knots, western Arctic coast, east-northeast winds at 25 knots with 6-foot seas. And for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast, continue with the east winds at 20 knots, seas in ice-free water, especially along the central coast there at about 5 feet. And for tonight, areas of snow and blowing snow continue through the Bering Strait from the northwest coast there across St. Lawrence Island. And trough will keep snow and gusty winds over the eastern Bering Sea and Nunivak Island, but winds will diminish for the Pribilofs and eastern Aleutians tonight with diminishing snow showers as well. Stay breezy for the Alaska Peninsula, and less wind and more showery conditions for the Panhandle, about the same for the North Gulf Coast. Tomorrow, chance of rain or snow with a weak trough moving into the eastern North Gulf Coast and Panhandle. Chance of light snow or mixed precipitation again south central Alaska. And lighter winds now over the eastern Bering Sea through the Bering Strait. Next storm pushes into the northern Bering Sea with rain and snow to the Pribilofs. Otherwise, a big storm moves up to the southwest of the Panhandle. It's going to produce storm force winds all along the coast by the afternoon with rain heavy at times, slowly moving northward, especially along the south coast, gradually working eastward and northward throughout the day. And winds on the increase over the south central Alaska area, Kodiak Island, and the North Gulf Coast. Thanks for joining us.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.